Good morning, everybody. For me now, I invite you all to take a seat, and we're going to start in a minute or two. Or less. Welcome, everybody, to St Nicholas Stevenage. It's lovely to welcome you all here, wherever you're from. And it's a delight to host this Bible manuscript seminar that Trevor is giving us. It's been a long time coming. We've been publicising it for a few months now, and so we've been lots of anticipation been building up ahead of today. As you may know, this seminar is being delivered both today as a day-long series, but also in March next year as a kind of 4-Friday series. So if you appreciate and value what you find today, please do feel free to pass on the news about the event in March as well, which will be across 4 Friday evenings in March next year, and people can come again then in sort of smaller, bite-sized chunks. I think that's all I need to say. I'm going to hand over to Trevor in a second. There will be breaks throughout the day, as I'm sure Trevor will set out, and there'll be plenty of time for asking Trevor follow-up questions and perusing the displays further, and of course having lunch. I've taken down all the details of those of you who have signed up for lunch, and Hannah is going to be popping down to the shops now to get us some tasty things for lunch. If there's anybody else who I missed on the lunch roundup on your way in, please do stick a hand up and grab me before Trevor's just as Trevor's starting, and we can add you to the list. Just other housekeeping to mention, there are, if you haven't found already, moves through the parish room and through the door on the right, there's 2 upstairs, 1 downstairs, and there shouldn't be a fire, but if we get the fire alarm sounds, then Paul, who's one of our emeritus church wardens, I'm sure will give us directions about what to do. Just follow the fire alarm sounds, what have you. And hopefully all parks okay, and there is more parking through the cemetery car park if anybody else is on their way. Right, okay, that's all from me. So over to Trevor.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So is my microphone working? Yes, I think it is. Okay, thank you so much for coming. I'm so honoured to have you here, and I hope you will find this informative and interesting. A couple of practical things first. We have 4 sessions. We will have breaks between the sessions, but I find that the pews are very hard. No one will be offended if you pick up a hassock and sit on it. All right, so if you want to do that, you may feel more comfortable. So you have the programme, and I think we're ready to start. So before the formal start, I just wanted to say I'm going to try to be looking at a monitor here as far as possible. A book that caused a lot of commotion and excitement, now about 20 years ago, was Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code. And it says that more than 300 years passed after the death of Christ before a dominant faction in the church in the 4th century chose the Gospels that we have today and rejected other Gospels that present, he says, a totally different picture of Jesus as not divine. I must point out that if you read the Da Vinci Code, at the beginning, behind the title page, it says this book is fiction. It is. One American anti-Christian writer has sold millions of books questioning the reliability of the Bible. We will see his name shortly. He claims that the text has been changed so we can have no certainty about what Jesus ever said or what the Bible originally said. And we won't duck his claims today. We'll look at them. TV documentaries, newspapers, magazines routinely quote from these ideas, and informally, so do school teachers in history and sometimes even in RE lessons. This is the background that influences the thinking of the average non-Christian in the West today. They assume that the text of the Bible has been changed. And whenever we talk to anyone about our faith, they're likely to have these ideas in the back of their mind. Well, that was the sermon. Today is not a sermon. It's not about doctrine. It's not about dogma. It is an opportunity to look at facts, to look close up at the evidence about the text of the Bible. It will also give key information and even some of the vocabulary that is useful to talk about these matters. And if you want to go further, the handouts will give great pointers for further research. So, in the first session, this is the first session, there were 2 handouts, and we'll see if we get some volunteers. Just grab one of these and pass them on. There we are. And I haven't kept a copy for myself, but anyway, this gives you some of the key vocabulary and pointers. I might keep walking away from the camera. There isn't a chalk mark on the floor, I'm afraid. So, all right, so that's the first handout, and there'll be another one partway through this session. So this first session gives important background information to help us to understand the whole day and to understand these facsimiles of the major Bible manuscripts that we will see in the other sessions. As it introduces so many important concepts, session 1 will be the longest session. You might want to reach for that cushion. But I will give you a break partway through to stretch, stand up if you want to, turn round before we continue. And I have to say that some of the most important information will be at the end of the final session this afternoon. This is not a trick to keep you here till the end, but that's where the information belongs. In this first session, we will look at the most important papyri and even learn how to spell the word if necessary. So here we go. I have to be careful. Say Paul. They're both Pauls. Paul Schimmel. Here we go. It says, when I look up there, a light shines in my eyes, so I can't really read it. Session 1. So this is about the oldest manuscripts of the Bible, and it aims to answer the question, has the text of the Bible been changed? Someone said to me, why look at old Bible manuscripts? Well, the Bible is the foundation document of the Christian faith, and of course the part that we call the Old Testament is the foundation document of the Jewish faith as well. And for Christians and for Jews, the Bible is the Word of God. And in terms of the New Testament, well, even the Old Testament, it is the principal evidence of the life, death and resurrection of Jesus. And it is our authority concerning our beliefs. And what is a manuscript? A manuscript is merely a handwritten document. And until the invention by Johannes Gutenberg of movable type printing presses in Mainz, in Germany, in the 1440s. All documents in the Western world were handwritten. They were manuscripts. And if someone wanted a copy of a document, they either had to copy it out by hand, or they had to pay someone to do that. And I have to tell you that 2,000 years ago and more, there were copy shops where you could pay someone to copy any document. And we can often see the evidence of that, even with some of the biblical manuscripts, because at the end, they put the number of lines. Because the emperor, or one of the Roman emperors, had determined the price per line that could be charged. And so they would count the number of lines. And say 324 lines or whatever it was. So, good, okay, we're going on. Originally, documents were written on scrolls. Here we've got a picture of a scroll on a spindle. And as soon as it was written, it was copied. And we go to the next slide, symbolically shows that further copies were made. The documents were disseminated. We're not going to have too many Bible verses today. Well, maybe we will. But just setting the scene, Colossians chapter 4, verse 16 says this: after this letter has been read to you, make sure it gets read also in Laodicea. And get the letter that went to Laodicea and have it read to you. You might say, well, there's no letter to Laodicea in our Bible. But it would appear that that was the same letter that went to Ephesus. All right? So, people were sharing these letters. And by the way, it seems from evidence that the Apostle Paul always kept a copy of the letters that he wrote. Anyway, on the day of Pentecost, when the church was born, we are told that they were staying in Jerusalem God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. And it lists them from Judea, from Cappadocia in central Turkey, from other areas of Turkey, from Mesopotamia, Syria, Egypt, Arabia, Libya in North Africa, Rome in Europe, on the day of Pentecost. The island of Crete in the Mediterranean, and many other countries. And many of those people, well, we know at least 2,000 of them, became Christians and then returned to their countries of origin. And within a few years, there were also Christian communities in various parts of Greece. I've told you about that in the New Testament. In Athens, in Macedonia, in Corinth, in Thessaloniki, in Philippi, also in Cyprus, in Sicily, and other parts of southern Italy, in Gaul or France, in Spain, in southern Egypt. That's not mentioned in the Bible, but we'll get to it today. Those believers eagerly received copies of the New Testament documents soon after they were written. We know that this is the case because some of those documents have been discovered, especially in the last 130 years, since the 1890s, in many of these different places. Okay, next slide. Conspiracy theories, conspiracy theory number 1. And we can go on to the next title. My notes may not say what that says, but I can't read that, so... The question is, were all the manuscripts containing the word Jehovah gathered in and destroyed as is claimed by the Jehovah's Witnesses? Because of the speed with which these manuscripts were copied and disseminated throughout the known world of the time, it was impossible for anyone to have control of all the copies of any manuscript. It was impossible for what the Jehovah's Witnesses claim to happen. Also, there was no central authority. No one had the authority to order this. I mention an article, next slide, I think, yes, okay. I mentioned an article called God's Sacred Name in the Bible. Was the word for God written in Hebrew letters in the ancient Greek manuscripts of the Jewish scriptures? And I'm giving a number of links today, you can't possibly write that down, it'll be on the handout, to articles on one of my websites, a Christian website. Now, I'm not promoting my website, I'm not trying to get more people to my website, it's not monetized, on the contrary, it costs me money to maintain. But today we can't go into massive detail on some of these matters, and you will find that detail in articles on my website. On the same theme, I have another article called What is the Real Meaning of Matthew 6:9? It's part of the Lord's Prayer, hallowed be thy name. And again, the Jehovah's Witnesses say that means we should call God Jehovah. Well, you'll have that on the handout. Let's go to another conspiracy theory. That's the one. Did scribes or church leaders change the text to make it line up with their doctrine? This has been claimed essentially by that one American, Bart Ehrman, whose name is spelled on one of the handouts. But he has written books with exaggerated claims that are eagerly referred to by skeptics from other religions. What he says is not supported by the real experts in biblical manuscripts. We'll give an example of just one expert, Daniel B. Wallace, there he is, senior research professor of New Testament studies at Dallas Theological Seminary, and also he's the director of the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. We mention him again in a bit today. He says, rather than having hundreds of years without a witness to the New Testament, we have a few decades. And that's from his book, Revisiting the Corruption of the New Testament. Now, as an example of a supposed corruption, Bart Ehrman gives Matthew chapter 24, verse 36. But about that day or hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. The next slide repeats that same verse. The phrase, nor the Son, is missing in just two very late manuscripts. But this looks like a slip by a copyist, not someone trying to defend the deity of Christ. It looks like a slip for various reasons. If the copyist had wished to deny that the Son did not know the day of the second coming, he or she, and sometimes it was women who were copying these manuscripts, he or she would have needed to remove the word only to. Let's read it. But about that day or hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, but only the Son. When he did a bad job, because he didn't remove the word only. If he or she had wished to remove that statement, it would have been necessary to do the same thing in the parallel passage which comes in Mark's Gospel, Mark 13:32, where all the manuscripts have nor the Son. Both of the manuscripts that Bart Ehrman refers to were produced about 700 years after the time when the New Testament was written. Here we have things today that were produced within 25 or 30 years of being written. We have the originals. Well, here we have photocopies. visit them in Manchester University, in Cambridge University, in the British Library. I'll be going there, God willing, again on Monday to the British Library, where I will go, and I never miss it. I go and look at Codex Sinaiticus. The original, that's session 2. We'll get to that later. So, if there were only one manuscript and it had been changed, we would have no way of knowing that. If there were only 2 manuscripts and they were different at some point, we would have no way of knowing which one was right and which one was wrong. But there are thousands of manuscripts, so we can be confident that we know what the original text said. It is precisely because we have so many manuscripts that Ehrman is able to claim that the text has been changed in a given manuscript. If we didn't have those manuscripts, we wouldn't know. He wouldn't know. So Ehrman's claims rely on evidence that proves him wrong. As someone said recently, when you see a difference in a manuscript, it stands out like a sore thumb because of the evidence we have. Now, experts in biblical manuscripts call each manuscript a witness, and we have thousands of witnesses. Now, what about variants? That's an important question. We're told there are lots of variants. There may be disagreement as to whether Johannes, John, should be spelt with 1 N or 2, or whether David should be spelt D-A-V-I-D, or in Vaticanus it's spelt D-A-V-E-I-D. But they're Hebrew names anyway, which have been transliterated into Greek, and even so the spelling doesn't change our knowledge of who is being referred to. We can say that those variants are untranslatable. In English we're going to write John and David. In Spanish they will write Juan and David, and so on. The meaning hasn't been changed. When people say that there are thousands of variants in biblical texts, that may be true for a series of reasons. There are thousands of manuscripts. Greek spelling was largely phonetic, which means that words were spelt as they were pronounced. Greek was spoken over a vast area, and there were different regional accents which are reflected in the spelling. Many so-called variants are where a single vowel in a verb has been changed, reflecting a different pronunciation. The word is the same, the meaning is the same. It's just another of those untranslatable variants. Also, copies were made over a period of more than 1,000 years, well, 1,400 years approximately, until the printing press was invented, and some spelling conventions changed over time. These documents are hundreds of pages long. We'll see some of these in the course of today. I have to say, actually, go away from the camera, I'm sorry. This is the display for session 1. We're going to talk through each of these briefly, you'll be relieved to know. And then we're going to move them away, probably to that table over there, in front of where the band, the musicians would be. There were also tables, there's a table in front of the organ here, there's a table over there with a lot of very interesting copies of manuscripts, and there's a table over here. So in the course of today, this table will change, and these things that you may or may not be able to see over here on the side will appear here as we go through different manuscripts. So, anyway, so I've lost my place. The copies were made over thousands of years. They're hundreds of pages long. They were copied by hand, one letter at a time, in a process that took many months to complete, to copy out the Bible. some variants are inevitable. So there were claimed to be thousands of variants, but we're talking of over 5,000 manuscripts. Are there thousands of variants between these thousands of manuscripts? The answer is perhaps. People quote outlandish numbers. People say there were 400,000 variants. That is a guess. No one has ever counted them. No one has counted them. No one academic in any country has access to all the manuscripts and is going to sit down and read each time David is spelled differently. So, those claims are guesses. Do they raise doubt about what the original text said? No. We haven't started yet. I told you it's the longest session. We're going to go on to the manuscript soon. Another conspiracy theory. Conspiracy theory. Did a church council reject some Gospels as Dan Brown claims in the Da Vinci Code and accept or choose others? I'm going to refer to Michael J. Kruger. He is a renowned and respected academic. He is president of the Charlotte, North Carolina campus of Reformed Theological Seminary in the USA. He is the author of a number of important books on biblical manuscripts and the canon of Scripture, and I've read several of his books and I would recommend them. So he says, the earliest Christians did not view themselves as choosing books, nor did they view themselves as having the right or the power to do such a thing. Instead, they viewed themselves as receiving the books that had been handed down to them by the apostles and their companions. It would not have dawned on them that they could just pick whatever books they happen to prefer. He goes on to say it is true that in later centuries there were church councils that made declaration about the canon, which books are in the Bible. But those councils did not view themselves as creating or deciding the canon, but merely affirming what they believed the canon had always been. Right, we come on to a picture, I think. We do. Tatianus. The Americans pronounce his name Tatian, to rhyme with nation. I'm going to call him by his Latin name, Tatianus. Tatianus was born near the beginning of the 2nd century, between 100 and 110 AD. Perhaps 5 to 15 years after the death of the Apostle John. Tatianus died in the year 185 AD. As a young man, he travelled to Rome and he met the famous Christian leader Justin Martyr, born about the same time as him, and died, was in fact martyred at the age of 65. Tatianus in Rome became a Christian, and he wrote something known as a harmony of the Gospels, called the Diatessaron. A harmony of the Gospels brings in the stories from all the different Gospels into one continuous narrative. In fact, Diatessaron should be pronounced Diatessaron, because it's Greek, and it means from, for. The text is made up of quotations from the 4 Gospels, all 4 of them, the ones that you and I know, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, and no other book. And an English translation of this was published a few years ago, and that's a photo of my copy of it. So, Tatianus wrote at least 175 years before the adoption of Christianity by the Emperor Constantine, before the Nicene Council of 325 AD. I'm going to mention someone else, Irenaeus, who was a bishop and leader of the church in France. He was born about 130 AD and died about 202 AD, and he wrote, "There can be no more and no fewer than 4 Gospels." There is already no debate or doubt about which writings about Christ were the authentic Gospels. The idea that centuries later some Gospels were chosen and others were rejected is pure fiction that contradicts the undisputed facts of history. Now we'll go on to something else. The languages in which the Bible was written. This is the beginning of Genesis chapter 1. It was written in Hebrew, and there are a few small areas of what we call the Old Testament which were written in Aramaic, which uses the Hebrew alphabet. So that is, well, it says the modern font. That font has been used for nearly 2,000 years for writing Hebrew. About 250 years before the time of Christ, in Alexandria, in North Africa, the Jewish scriptures began to be translated into Greek. This is called the Septuagint, derived from the belief that there were 70 translators. And so the abbreviation used for it in texts is the Roman numeral for 70. So here we can now see Genesis 1 in a modern Greek font, translated by the Jews 250 years before the time of Christ. And the next slide shows us the Greek and the Hebrew side by side. And you'll notice that the Hebrew writes from right to left, and the Greek writes from left to right. Okay. So, next question is, what were the documents written on? And the initial answer is papyrus. Yeah, we have a picture. This is a plant from Egypt, and it was cut down and the stem was cut into strips, and the strips were laid out vertically and then horizontally, and they were hammered together, and then they were cut out to a nice shape, and they were polished, sanded down, and that is papyrus. The next thing is the format, and initially documents, we're talking at the time of the Romans and the Greeks, documents were written on a roll or a scroll. There's a sample one, that's actually the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. And so these pieces of papyrus were glued together and formed a scroll. And normally, the scroll was only written on that side. There are a couple of places in the Bible, in the book of Ezekiel and in the book of Revelation, where it speaks of documents written on the inside and the outside. But that wasn't common. Normally they were just written on the inside. So that is a roll or a scroll. But then we come to another format called the codex. A codex is a set of sheets folded together and sewn to make something that's called a choir. And I thought, especially in the church, I had to give you the spelling of the word choir. All right? And it's nothing to do with singing. This is like a school exercise book, really, except it hasn't got metal staples. It's sewn. So the earliest codices, that's the plural codex, the earliest codices are made of papyrus. Starting in the 4th century, which is the 300s, parchment, which is animal skins, started to replace papyrus as it was more durable. I have to say, by the way, I shouldn't miss this out, the people who promoted the codex were the Christians. This was the new technology of the day. And people still thought, well, if a document is important, it has to be on a scroll. But the Christians liked the Codex. And the Codex has various advantages. It could hold a whole book of any size. About the longest book ever seen on a scroll is Luke's Gospel or the Book of Acts. And the other Gospels are shorter, the other books in the New Testament are shorter. So that was as much as you could get. But with the Codex, it could hold a whole book of any size. It was cheaper than a scroll because you write on both sides of the material. It was, of course, easier and quicker to find your place. You could put in a bookmark. It is easier to transport and to hide. So, we fade to a black screen for a moment, and we're going to talk about some of these papyri now. The period of great discoveries, I think we're going straight on, Paul, were the 19th and 20th centuries. And two people who are very famous are Bernard Pine Grenfell and Arthur Savage Hunt. And we've got pictures of them. There we are. And they were looking for ancient manuscripts, and the particular ones they found were in a place called Oxyrhynchus, and it was in January 1897. Oxyrhynchus is actually a Greek word, but it is a place in the Upper Nile, which means southern Egypt. All right, so it's southern Egypt, and there they found a trove of manuscripts. The screen says P1. There's a tradition of writing letter P for papyrus in a Gothic font, but I don't even do it myself all the time today. You don't have to if it's not on your keyboard. And these papyri are numbered according to when they were found. So P1 is not necessarily the oldest one. It was the first one that was found. All right? So, and we're going to look at P1. Let's do this. Let's do this. So this says P1. Am I still in shot? I'm still in shot. This is not the original. But this is P1. And it starts with the words Biblos Genesios Jesu Christou Filiou David. Book of the Genesis or origin of Jesus Christ, the son of David, son of Abraham. And it is Matthew chapter 1. And it's a codex, it's written on both sides. So, there are a few characters missing. But you can read this. I mean, I sit down, I can read that. It's written in Greek. I'm going to mention something else that's not on my script, but I think it's important to say. There are all sorts of claims and theories out there. Someone wrote to me a few years ago here in Stevenage, and he had discovered on the internet that the New Testament wasn't written in Greek at all. It was written in Syriac and translated into Greek. Well, I wrote to Larry Hurtado. Larry Hurtado was professor of New Testament language and literature at New College, Edinburgh University. And I said, you know, is this a gap in my knowledge? I didn't know this. And well, he was fully involved professionally at the time, but that particular day, he must have been at his computer. And within half an hour, he wrote back and he said, there is not an academic in the world that believes that. And I told the person who had written to me, and he said, he wasn't there. And I thought, Nor will you. You don't want to know. You don't want to know what it says. Anyway, going on P1 there, those first two letters, iota, deca, and then that is P1. If we go to the next point, in Vaticanus, it doesn't say iota, deca. It says decatesares. Well, they look pretty different, don't they? And we click again, we see what iota delta means. It means numeral 14. And we see what decatesares means. It means the word 14. So, and in fact, if you know Matthew chapter 1, numeral 14 occurs 3 times in that chapter. And so there are 3 variants between Vaticanus and P1. You can see what authors say, what they mean when they say the variants are untranslatable. Normally in our Bibles, numerals are written as words. Sometimes it's a very big number, it's written as a numeral. So there's Daniel Wallace again. These differences are technically variants, but most variants are untranslatable. So we have a picture of P1, which I've just shown you. It has been dated at 200 to 225 AD. So it's not the oldest of the things we have. It just happens to be the first one they found in 1997. The key features are that there are no gaps between the words. Now I have to say there were no gaps between words in Greek writing or in Latin writing at the time. And that's not a problem. I mean, I'm a linguist. And we think, because, you know, we don't remember a time when we couldn't read. We learned to read when we were very little. And we think that there are silences between the words when we speak. I can assure you that there aren't. And if we try to learn a foreign language, we think they speak so fast, because there are no gaps between the words. There are no gaps between our words too. Sometimes there are pauses, which we show with commas and semicolons and full stops and that sort of thing, but there are no gaps between the words. Another thing to say is that at that time, in Roman culture, Greek culture, whatever culture, Jewish culture, people only read out loud. They hadn't realised that you could sort of read in your head. They only read out loud. There's one clue to that in Acts chapter 8, as you probably know. Philip running along behind the chariot of the eunuch from Ethiopia, who was reading from Isaiah chapter 53. How did Philip know? Well, God didn't tell him, he was just listening. Right? They read out loud. And so as we read these manuscripts, as I read them, I read the Bible in Greek every day, and I always read out loud. It helps me. It helps me to develop my skill and my fluency in Koine Greek. I am not a speaker of modern Greek. I always say I can't order a coffee or a beer, because those words aren't in the Bible. The pronunciation has changed. The pronunciation is very different. And so modern Greeks at school, rather as we have to study Shakespeare, they study some of the Greek classics. But if they want to read the Bible, they read a new version, which is obviously, as far as possible, based on the original Greek text, but with spelling changes and some verb forms have changed. You know, it has in English, we don't say doeth anymore, all right? We say do. So I'm not a speaker of Greek, but I am a reader of Greek. Now the next thing, we're ready to go, is that they were all written in capital letters. These are sometimes called uncials, or they're just called majuscules. And I'm going to do the implications for John 1:1. So let's see John 1:1. All right, that's in a modern script. Forgive me if I read it. You may hear me read this more than once today. In arche en ho logos. In the beginning was the Word. Kai ho logos en pros ton theon. and the Word was with God. Kai theos en ho logos. And the Word was God. So that's a modern font. So if we click again, we'll see it. We've got a problem. We've not got the right font. So can you do the next one, Paul? Oh, I know we haven't got the right font on your computer. All right, okay. I wanted you to see it in the old font, so you're not going to see it in the old font because it's not installed on the computer here. I'm sorry about that. But the next thing, yes, go back one, Paul. Lovely, that's it. Thank you. So, the second line was supposedly showing it in an old font, which you can see, you'll see in photographs today, all in capital letters. And I wanted to talk again, they're not the target of today, but I did want to talk about the Jehovah's Witnesses. Because they deny that Jesus is God. And in John 1:1 they write, the Word was with God, capital G, and the Word was a God, little g. Well, they had the word a, which is not a word in Greek, isn't there? Then they claim that there's a difference between God with a capital G and God with a little g. So if we click on that again, I don't know if you can see it, I have just put the letter theta, which is the first letter of the word God, in red. And I can assure you that it is exactly the same in both places. There isn't a big G and a little g. It was all written in capitals. So, next screen, I'm afraid, is going to show it to us in a modern font, I think. All right, we'll go on to something else. Okay. Next question. How can we know the date of a manuscript? Some manuscripts have the dates on them. Some manuscripts have a dated document on the back. Especially in the case of papyrus, it was scarce and it was expensive. And sometimes people wrote things on the back. They might have sold a donkey or sold a house. And they record it on a convenient document they have, which happens to be one of the Gospels. And it records the date. So you know that the Gospel on the other side was written before the event described in their legal documents of buying or selling a donkey, or buying or selling a house. So some have dates on the back. Some manuscripts are found with other documents are dated, but the main way is paleography, which is looking at fonts, analysing the handwriting. Now I'm going to mention P52, so it was found after P1, but this, which is in Manchester University, is a fragment from John's Gospel. John chapter 18, it is a codex written on both sides. One can definitely read it. And it has been dated between 100 and 150 AD. It's probably 125 AD. And it's within 30 years of the death of the Apostle John. It is incredibly old. We have a bit more on P52 on the next slide. So it's a codex, it says it's written on both sides. It's from John's Gospel. The next couple of clicks I've already told you. It gives the references, and it's in Manchester. All right, we go to a blank screen, which is not a technical error. We are coming on to, where are they? We are coming on to handout 2. Who's got the handouts? Here now. All right. So, as you take a handout, please feel free to stand up and stretch and turn around if you want to, if you're feeling uncomfortable. I did tell you this is the longest session, and this is setting us up for the day. So there is handout 2. So we've hardly started. We're doing background of what is a manuscript and what is papyrus and what is a codex and all that sort of thing. And we've only looked at 2 papyri so far. think that's good. Okay, are we ready to look at that handout? It's an introduction to an important theme. It's called Nomina Sacra, which is a Latin title. The title was invented by a German theologian, but the concept wasn't, just the title was invented by a German theologian in 1906. Nomina Sacra means sacred names, and I'm saying here they're more than just nomina sacra, sometimes they are nomina divina, they are divine names. And the Christians had a special way of writing certain key words. And if we look at the first one here, the first line, sorry, this is in a Greek font, but I can't do this in a non-Greek font. The first line says theos, which means God. And without going into Greek grammar, words can have 4 or 5 forms, depending whether they're the subject of the sentence or the object of the sentence. So here we've got theos, which is God, the subject. Theon is the object, that's in John 1 as well, the word was with God. Theou, which means of God, and Theo, which means to God. And these important divine words were written in a special way. Usually, the first letter and the last letter with a bar above them. So you can see I've put the same 4 in the nomina sacra form. Theos, Theon, Theo, Theo. The first and last letter with a bar above them. And this was a way of showing reverence to God. This was not shorthand. It wasn't space saving. Some people have said that, but it wasn't space saving. It was a way of showing reverence to God and to these certain key words. And Christians use these, and I have to say also that they pronounce the word in full. I say this because, of course, with Yahweh in the Hebrew, sometimes called Jehovah, the Jews don't pronounce that because they are worried about pronouncing God's name. And whenever they come on the word Yahweh in the Hebrew script, they say Adonai, which means Lord in Hebrew. So this is not the same. These words are normal words that are said. Second line is Kyrios. Kyrios means Lord. And if you skip across the 4 words, you can see that that is sometimes abbreviated in 2 different ways. Either the first and the last letter looks like KC, it's Kappa and Sigma. Sigma was written like the letter C at that time, with a bar above it. The next one looks like KPC, but it is Kappa Rho Sigma. So sometimes that was written with 3 letters. So these were divine names. Christians did exactly the same thing with the name Jesus. And so the third line says Jesus. Jesus, Yesun, Yesu. And if we look at Jesus, sometimes it was written with the first 2 letters. It looks like an I and an H. With the bar above it. Sometimes it's written with the first and last letter, looks like an I and C. Sometimes it is written with 3 letters. And then Christos.
Can I ask which slide is it? I can't read Greek. So.
Right, that's fine.
That's the first one.
Yes, okay.
And then
All
you've
right.
got 10 similar ones after it.
You can't go beyond there, Paul.
Sorry?
Can you do the next one?
The next one's that.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. Your Greek is not up to scratch. That's the trouble. All right. So that says Jesus, and the next line says Christos. Christos means anointed one. It means Christ. And so if we run along the line there, it looks like XP, but it's the first two letters. Cairo, or the first and last letter. Those are two ways of writing Christ as a nomina sacra. Slightly later, other words were added, and the next one down, that's it. We're not going to go through all of these, but if you want to scribble in the margin, the first one, pneuma, means spirit. The next one, pater, means father. The next one, huios, means son. Obviously about Christ, the Son of God, not any old son. And soter means saviour. And as we look at manuscripts throughout today, you'll be able to read some of those, you'll be able to recognise some of those abbreviations in the different manuscripts. Okay, so that's sort of background, useful background, and we'll come back to the bottom line of that in a few minutes' time. Not doing the bottom line yet. And we're going to go on to, I'll walk out of the camera probably, we're going to go on to P66. That's it, P66. Dated about 150 AD. This is fantastic. This is John's Gospel, almost complete. It's John's Gospel. You can read it, I've read it. That's the introduction. You can read it, you can understand it, you'll see all these nomina sacra forms. And this is John's Gospel. From maybe 150 AD. So we put, it's a codex, but it is made of papyrus, as documents were at that time. So we've talked about fragments. That's a fragment. You might say, how important can that be? Well, that tells us that in the year 125 AD, hundreds of miles away, people were reading John's Gospel. That's why it's important. But it's much better to have nearly the whole of the Gospel. So that's P66. We've got various slides there. Almost complete. It's easy to read. About 150 AD, about 55 years after the Gospel was written. It's part of a collection called the Bodmer Papyri, known as Papyrus Bodmer II. Let's go on to another one, P45. Well, we've got these here. P45, P46, P47. I mean, these are whole books. We'll talk through them now, just briefly. These are whole books from the New Testament. So, P45 is from about 200 AD, 200 to 225 AD. And it contains the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles. So it's one of these here. The pages are numbered, unfortunately in Greek numerals, but you can get to learn the Greek numerals. It starts easy, because it's the letters of the alphabet. Alpha is 1, beta is 2, gamma is 3, delta is 4, and so on. We already saw 14 a while ago. So this is P45. It's located, there's someone here, I won't embarrass her, I can tell her where it's located because she saw it a few months ago. It's located in the Chester Beatty Museum in Dublin. I've never been to Dublin, but if I did go, that would be the reason, that would be the motive, to see it. You can go, it's on display. And one page from Matthew's Gospel is in the Austrian National Library in Vienna. Now you need to understand how this happened. This is mostly in the 20th century. There would be dealers who would purchase these manuscripts, maybe from manual labourers, farmers who'd found them, and then they would sell them to whichever Westerner gave the biggest amount. And typically, they would show someone one page and say there's more like this, and they'd show someone else one page, and they say there's more like this. And then they'd end up drip feeding, selling pages to different people. And it's only as these began to be photographed, and especially with the internet, that people realised in different parts of the world that they had different pages of the same document. Okay, let's go on to P46. So we've just had the Gospels and Acts. Here we've got the epistles. The next one will give us the date, which is 200 to 275 AD. And this has the epistles of the Apostle Paul. Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Colossians, Philippians, slightly different order, it doesn't matter, 1 Thessalonians, and also Hebrews. And it's in Dublin as well. And a few pages are in the University of Michigan in the United States. P47. This is the book of Revelation. So now we have almost the whole New Testament. A few epistles missing. The book of Revelation, also in Dublin. And it was photographed about 3 years ago, 4 years ago. And these are the photographs that we have here. Daniel Wallace, whom we've quoted from, who set up the Centre for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. That is incredibly important. All right, we want to go back to the handout for one more nomen sacrum. And that's the word stavros. In modern Greek, I'm told it's pronounced stavros, and it's the person's name, but it means cross. And there was a special way of writing cross. And so you can look at it there as we go across. It's a bit longer. They took the first two letters and then the last two letters. But they superimposed the T and the rho, the letter R, looks like a P. They superimposed them on top of each other, and they put the bar above. That is the word stavros, and this shows this is the earliest pictorial representation of Christ on the cross. Can you see that? If you look at probably at your handout rather than on the screen, that second letter, that is the cross with the head of Christ above it. Again, I hope for the last time today, I mentioned the Jehovah's Witnesses who say that Christ wasn't crucified on the cross. He was crucified on the torture stake, they say. Well, the word torture isn't there, and they just do not understand the Greek language. But this is the earliest visual representation of Christ crucified on the cross. It's not exactly a picture, but it shows Christ on the cross. Okay, and so we need to come to P75. Good, P75. This is now in the Vatican. And it contains John's Gospel and most of Luke's Gospel. It's from about 175 AD. We want to look at just one word. Yes, we're going to zoom in a series of slides. We're just going to look at that one word. So, here it is. It's not an accurate colour one here. You've got a more accurate colour on the screen. But this is P75. John's Gospel and Luke's Gospel. And as we click again, And we go, actually, the third line, if you go back one, Paul, the third line, I just read the few words there, the middle line, says, Bastase ton stauron. The next line says, autu. Bears his cross. And the last word is his cross. Then we go on, Paul, that says the cross. And I think there's one more. So I hope you can see that. And that is, it says, it's a divine word. It's a special word. It is the cross of Christ. And finally, just to, because there'll be questions anyway, can we just click on to a couple more things? These things, these are called monograms. The first one, and it's on your handout, shows, it looks like, well, it's meant to be an I and an H. It's meant to be Jesus. But sometimes it was written, I love this, it was written by the scribe, they rather lengthened the horizontal bar. And so it says Jesus. But what does it show? It shows 3 crosses. And finally, one that is not, one or two that are not in the Bible, but people will ask me. So that's the Chi Rho, which is just an abbreviation for Christ. It's become popular in lots of churches, but I'm not seeing that in any manuscript. I think there are 1 or 2 more slides, Paul, might be. Let's keep going. All right, so this is popular especially in the Catholic Church, and INRI is not Greek, but I wanted to mention it because people will ask. It's from the Latin Vulgate. It's John 19:19, which is Jesus Nazarenus Rex Judaeorum, which in Greek, so you understand it, is Jesus or Nazaraios ho Basileos ton Judaeum, or in English, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews, was put on the cross. And so that is used. And another one is IHS, as it looks like. It's derived from the Nomina Sacra for Jesus, but it's been Latinized, because that standard S, I just can go on, that standard S is not Greek. So those are a couple of other things. Now, what we want to say is, if you have any questions of a general nature, I will try to answer them, and then we will take a pause and do come and look at things, and we'll have a bit of a break. But first, if there are any questions, someone has a microphone. If someone wants to ask a question. Right, okay, I think it's different. Okay, well, I am asked to say, for those, I see a hand. All right, while the microphone is coming, I will say for those watching on YouTube, and you should be able to see this on YouTube, that at the end of this recording, there will be a link added subsequently, a few minutes later, to the next recording. So there will be 4 videos on YouTube. Okay, here we go with the question. Let's have that from here.
Could you just repeat the difference between a codex and a scroll?
I didn't understand enough of that.
The difference between a codex and a scroll.
A codex and a scroll?
Yeah.
Yes, okay. So, well, that's a scroll, if you like. That's a scroll. Yeah. All right. This one actually happens to have, has a map on it. And it shows the area conquered by Alexander the Great, all the way to the gates of India and far west to Greece. And all these areas spoke Greek, and a lot more than this. Also North Africa, Egypt and through to Cyrene. So that is the scroll. And scrolls were the posh way of presenting documents, any document, in Latin or Greek. But in the early years of Christianity, the 100s, the Christians introduced this concept of a book. That is a codex. So codex is just a Latin word for book. Right? A series of pages, joined, however they may be usually sewn together, joined and written on both sides. That's the codex. Alright? So that's a different way of presenting it. Any other question? Yes, I see a hand. John down here.
Shall I use a big voice?
YouTube won't hear you.
Oh, sorry. Enlightening, wonderful. I always thought that most of our evidence came from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Do you go on to talk about that? Because I thought that was all that we ever found, but obviously it isn't.
No, I don't, but I'll say something briefly. Now, my emphasis today and my particular expertise is in Greek and in the Greek manuscripts. The Dead Sea Scrolls were written in Hebrew. And the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in about 1947, so don't quite remember the exact dates of this. And one way of starting, they were scrolls, okay? So they were scrolls, they were pre-Christian scrolls, and they were stored in clay jars. And they were discovered, well, we don't need to go into the whole story of their discovery. They were discovered 60, 70 years ago, and they have gradually been photographed and analysed, and they contain various religious documents, but the most important ones are the Old Testament, or large parts of the Old Testament, including the whole of, or nearly the whole of the book of Isaiah in Hebrew. The Jews had a different way of, they copied the scripture and they were so careful, they were so thorough, and they counted every letter. And they knew how many letters there were on a page. And if they got to the end of a copy and it didn't have the same number, they burnt it. So they were so careful. And we have here, on that display over there, one of the oldest manuscripts, Hebrew manuscripts of the Old Testament. And that dates from, it's called the Codex Leningradensis, because it's stored in the city that was for a time called Leningrad, and it's retained its name because there are other manuscripts that are called Codex Peterburgensis, so they couldn't change the name, so it's still called Leningradensis. It is about the oldest complete Old Testament we have, and it is from 1000 AD. So it's 1,000 years after the time of Christ, and maybe 1,600 years after the time of Isaiah, 2,000 years after the time of King David. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls, when they were found, the text was the same. So the Jews did a good job, all right? But Dead Sea Scrolls are not, as far as I'm aware, about Christian documents, and though I do talk about the Old Testament quite a bit in the other sessions, my focus is on the Greek. Okay? Okay, Richard, yes. Thank you for my runner. You're a real servant, Edward. Thank you so much.
So you talked about thousands of copies. So how many, what's the most number of copies of a complete gospel, or are there really almost none?
About 5,000. Over a period of 1,000 years.
Yeah.
All right? So we go through this today. Because we've been talking about papyri, we have talked about some of the oldest ones in this first session. The second session goes into what's called the world's oldest Bible. So I won't talk about that now, but we'll do that in a few minutes' time. But yes, there are thousands of manuscripts, and we'll come back to that in the course of the day. Okay, I think you deserve a break. I turned off my phone because I was told it would interfere with the microphone. I don't have a watch, so I've got no idea what the time is, but hopefully we can stop and start again in 11:30. All right, well, session 2 is due to start 11:30, so let's go. All right, we've got to give you a 5 to 10 minute break, and I'm going to change this to